This video is dedicated to the memory of my mother, Rebecca Custer. Rest in peace, Mom. I love you. We've all heard it before, and many of you may have even felt and said it yourselves when looking at a piece by Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko. I could have made that myself, or that looks like it was made by drunk monkeys. To some viewers, at first glance, many of these pieces look simplistic in nature, where the artist seemingly displays very little in the way of technical skill with their craft, and even less in the way of creativity. After all, they basically painted simple geometric shapes, or, as in the case of Jackson Pollock, threw paint on a canvas using different colors seemingly chosen at random. Sure, we hear ridicule from some regarding these pieces, but many never stop to ask any questions. What inspired these artists to make these pieces? Why do galleries think these pieces are important? Is there really little in the way of technical skill required? I'll give you a hint on that last one. It requires a good deal of skill to make one of these pieces. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. The artists I just mentioned were both at the vanguard of an art movement known as Abstract Expressionism. This movement emerged in the United States after World War II. Abstract Expressionism was a shift from the social realism and regionalism that dominated artistic practice in North America in the decades leading up to and including the Great Depression era through the war. Think of American Gothic by Grant Wood, Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange, or just about any photographer from the Farm Security Administration, as the Depression proved fertile ground for photography to be used as a social tool. Or Diego Rivera's recreation of Man at the Crossroads. Abstract Expressionism moved away from representational art into non-representational territory, and drew heavily from European schools of thought, such as Futurism, Bauhaus, and Suprematism. Perhaps the two biggest influences, though, were German Expressionism, which allowed for intense emotions to come into play, and Surrealism, which had no issues with spontaneity and the surfacing of the subconscious in the process of art creation. It's important to understand that non-objective art wasn't anything new. In the decades prior to World War II, Europe and the United States were, at least in terms of artistic practice, on divergent paths. Various art movements and schools of thought in Europe were already challenging their traditional ideas of art and art practice. This type of art had gained a lot of traction in Europe, so much so that it gained the attention of some bad actors once Adolf Hitler rose to power in the 1930s. During his reign as dictator of Nazi Germany, Hitler led a campaign against what he called Entartete Kunst, or degenerate art, which targeted much of the modern art in Europe at the time. In fact, most, if not all, non-objective art, as well as art created by communists, Jews, Freemasons, and others, was completely banned in Germany at the time. It was also banned for Germans in Nazi-occupied Europe outside of Germany. The Nazis, apparently, didn't care if the minds of non-Germans were, in their view, corrupted. Works by Pablo Picasso, Salvador Dali, Max Ernst, and others were confiscated and destroyed. Artists who were unable to leave were often subject to internal exile, and in many cases forbidden to create new art. If the artist happened to be Jewish. As an aside, I wonder if any art historians ever examined Hitler's official dislike of modern art versus his status as a failed artist. This is especially poignant when one looks at some of his work. He was definitely a traditional painter, as shown in the examples on your screen. But I digress. Prior to World War II, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, under the leadership of Alfred Barr, was bringing over European modern art and exposing it to American viewers, many of whom were seeing it for the very first time. The Guggenheim Museum, known then as the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, was founded in 1939, and its mission was to advance the appreciation of modern art in the United States. Max Ernst, along with Marcel Duchamp, and I can reasonably assume other European artists, fled to the United States to escape the previously mentioned Nazi crackdown. These individuals continued to work in exile, which helped modern art flourish outside of Europe. In 1950, a group of 18 artists co-authored an open letter to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City to protest the selection of jurors for an upcoming exhibition entitled American Painting Today, 1950. This group became known as the Irascibles, or the Irascible 18. These artists had been creating work that went against the norm in New York, and, thanks to the new network of galleries and museums, were starting to gain traction. It was their view, however, that their paintings would be ignored by the jurors, and thus they weren't even going to submit to the jury. The resulting media coverage, as well as the moves by some in support of the Irascibles, gained them more notoriety. This photo, produced by Nina Lean for Life magazine in 1951, brought the artists and their work to the forefront of not only the New York art community, but also that of the general public around the United States. Pictured here are 15 of those 18, and please forgive me if I don't get all the pronunciations correct. We have Theodoros Stamos, Jimmy Ernst, Barnett Newman, James Brooks, Mark Rothko, Richard Pousset Dart, William Baziotis, Jackson Pollock, Clifford Still, Robert Motherwell, Bradley Walker Tomlin, Willem de Kooning, Adolf Gottlieb, Ad Reinhardt, and Hedda Stern. Many of these vanguard artists were also part of what was informally known as the New York School. Let's look at some of their art. One thing one notices when looking at these works of art is that they tend to fall into one of two distinct styles. In one extreme, you have paintings that are full of action, such as this and the earlier Jackson Pollock example. The other extreme represents artists who painted fields of pure color. Perhaps the most famous of these is Mark Rothko. But Clifford Still and William Baziotis were also known for their color field paintings. Many of the artists, though, seem to create works somewhere in the middle. There were dominant colors, but not necessarily fields of color, with non-figurative details, such as this example by Hedda Stern. The artists also didn't just start producing in the style of their most famous works right off the bat. Like many artists, they evolved over the years. Take, for instance, the following paintings by Jackson Pollock. Prior to World War II, his work was much more figurative, such as in Peddler and untitled Naked Man with Knife. During the war, his work took a decidedly more abstract and much less figurative turn. It is also during this time that he begins to develop his signature drip and pour process that would characterize his later work. Another famous artist from this movement who evolved into his signature style was Mark Rothko. His early work was definitely influenced by Expressionism, such as can be seen in this 1936 self-portrait and this untitled work from 1938. During the war, Rothko took a turn toward the less figurative with this untitled work from around 1941 to 1942, and this work, entitled Primeval Landscape, from 1945. It was after the war when fields of color began to dominate the composition of his paintings. Pollock, Rothko, and the others mentioned were not the only practitioners of abstract expressionism. They are merely recognized as being on the vanguard of the movement. There are other artists considered important, but just not as famous outside the art community. Artists such as Paul Jenkins, Alma Thomas, and Grace Hartigan produced wonderful and important works. They just came along a little bit after the others. Abstract expressionism is also not limited to painting. Sculpture was also created within the movement's ideals. Such works include S by John Chamberlain and Sky Cathedral by Louise Nevelson. In these two examples, the sculptures are built from repurposed materials. This can be traced back to Duchamp's Fountain, a sculpture that is often hailed as the first piece of conceptual art ever made. That, however, is another video, and one on which I'm currently working. One thing several abstract expressionist artists sought was for the viewer to find their own meaning in a work of art, with Mark Rothko being one of the most famous to espouse this ideal. This often created a singular meaning in the work and made the connection viewer dependent, whereas many artists outside the movement most often use their art to convey their own specific message. This results from the abstract expressionism pieces having little, if any, formal elements outside the realms of color, and leads to difficulty when it comes to formal analysis of the art. Seriously, how do you formally analyze seemingly random drops of paint or a canvas with only two colors where the fields have no discernible lines or forms? In my own opinion, this lack of formal elements may be the source of frustration among more casual viewers. When you put something like Oath of the Horatii by David next to Stillness by Jimmy Ernst, you find it's much easier to talk about the neoclassical work, with its vibrant colors, discernible lines and shapes, and narrative, versus the seemingly random lines, no real forms, and lack of artist narrative in the abstract expressionist piece. Abstract expressionism's growth as a movement signaled a move, pun not intended, toward new ideas that challenged conventional ideas of aesthetics and the role of art in society. That is, whether art was supposed to tell you something, or if you were supposed to draw your own meaning. Because of this, other movements arose in reaction that were rejections of ideas such as subjectivism and spontaneity that were hallmarks of abstract expressionist art. Pop art arose with a focus on consumer culture in order to create many threads of meanings, with the ability for those meanings to be fluid, which were often reflections of the zeitgeist of the period. It sought to do this through combinations of abstraction and representation of everyday items. Andy Warhol was the most famous of these artists. Another example is that of hard-edge painting. These paintings generally maintain the non-representational nature of abstract expressionism, but showed much more rigidity in planning and execution. Notable examples include Carl Benjamin and Miriam Shapiro. For clarity, I use the term movement loosely with hard-edge painting. There are many who don't recognize hard-edge painting as a movement, but rather a style within other movements. When I examine some of the work, I think there is something to it being its own movement, but given the lack of any real school of thought to support the work aside from the other movements, it's a little hard to justify promoting it to that level. These art movements are also just a couple of examples. There are many more, and those will be future videos. In terms of photography, it's hard to really fit it within the time frame of abstract expressionism. Given that the camera is a recording tool, and the selective, rather than constructive, nature of photography, in the 1940s and 50s photographic practice was focused on, again, pun not intended, documentation. There were, however, notable exceptions. Aaron Siskin began experimenting with compositions and subject matter that most photographers simply looked past when out and about, Harry Callahan and Minor White also experimented with abstraction during this time. It was in later years that abstraction and expressionism started to gain more of a foothold among photographers, which, again, is another video. In the period of abstract expressionism as a movement, though, the art made, for the most part, consisted of painting and sculpture. As we've seen, abstract expressionism represented a radical departure from the predominant art produced in the United States prior to World War II. Its challenges to the then prevailing practices and thoughts about art in the US brought a revolution of sorts to the American art community and helped spawn many movements that continued to challenge what came before. And now it's time for our featured artist. In this video, I'm featuring the work of a couple from Tampa, Florida. Say hello to Luke and Sam James, the husband and wife creative team behind the website Street Teeth, which is a concert review and photography site. Both Luke and Sam have education in graphic design and do freelance design work, but in the past couple years have begun an active photography practice. Sam, who does most of the photography on the site, shows a masterful use of color to help draw the viewer in and to convey the vibe and energy of the show. Luke not only contributes photography, but his insightful words expertly add context to bring the series to life for the viewer. The link to Street Teeth, as well as their other work, can be found in the description below. So let's hear from you. How does abstract expressionism art speak to you? If, at the beginning of this video, you were of the opinion that it looked like it was made by drunk monkeys, has your opinion started to change? What do you think of the work of Luke and Sam James? Leave me a comment and let's talk about some art. If you've made it to this point, I want to thank you for watching. A like, a share, and a subscription if I have earned it will go a long way toward helping this channel grow. Once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you all again soon.